rain had not stopped falling for 3 days. It draped itself over the valley like a silver curtain, pooling in the hollows of ancient stones and threading through the roots of the great whispering oaks that lined the path to somewhere no ordinary map could show. The droplets tapped against every surface they found, leaves broad and narrow, the curved backs of sleeping snails, the rusted iron gates that hadn't been opened in 100 years, and the shoulders of a small girl named Poppy who walked through it, all without an umbrella, without a cloak, and without a single drop of water touching her skin. The rain sounds were everywhere. They played against the ground in soft, uneven patterns. Pit-pat, pit-pat-pat, S-H-H-H-H, pit-pat, like fingers drumming lazily on a wooden table. They cascaded from the gutters of ruined structures that lined the overgrown pathway, creating tiny waterfalls that spilled into streams no wider than a ribbon. They drummed on mushroom, caps the size of dinner plates, producing a deep, hollow resonance that hummed through the earth beneath Poppy's bare feet. And they whispered through the canopy above, a constant, breathy hush, SSSSSSHHHHHH, that seemed to carry words just beneath the edge of hearing. Words that might have been instructions, or warnings, or simply the rain saying its own name over and over again in a language older than language itself. Poppy listened to all of it. She had learned to listen in the days since she had first discovered the secret castle, since she had first pressed her palm against that impossible door carved with moons and spinning stars, and felt it open at her touch as though it had been waiting for her specifically, as though every lock ever made had been a preparation for this one unlocking. She had learned that the rain was not merely water falling from clouds. It was a conversation. It was a story being told in real time by the sky to the earth. And if you were quiet enough, truly, deeply quiet, the kind of quiet that lives in the space between heartbeats, you could understand it. She understood it now, at least a little, and what it was telling her tonight was that something inside the castle had changed. The path wound downward through a grove of silver birches whose bark gleamed like wet bone in the gray light. Rain tapped against each trunk with a slightly different pitch. Talk, talk, ting, talk, creating a scattered melody that followed Poppy like a procession of tiny musicians walking just behind her, playing their instruments in a rhythm that matched her footsteps. The ground beneath her was soft, a carpet of pine needles and decomposed leaves that drank the rain greedily, each needle receiving its drops with a sound like a single keystroke on a typewriter. Tap, 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 as though the forest were writing a very long letter to someone who lived far away. Poppy carried a single thing with her, a glass vial no larger than her thumb, stoppered with a cork carved into the shape of a sleeping owl. Inside the vial, something luminous shifted and swirled, not quite liquid, not quite light, but something in between that moved with the lazy intentionality of a creature dreaming. She had found it on her last visit to the castle, nestled in an alcove she hadn't noticed before, beside a note written in ink that changed color depending on the angle at which you held it. The note had said simply, "For the door that has no key." She hadn't known what it meant then. She wasn't entirely sure she knew what it meant now. But the rain had been insistent for the past 3 days, and its insistence had a quality to it that Poppy recognized from the first time she had found the castle. It was calling her, not with words exactly, but with a pull, a gentle gravitational tug in her chest that grew stronger whenever she stood still for too long, as though stillness itself was incorrect, as though the only right thing to do was to walk toward the castle until she arrived. So she walked. The rain walked with her. The silver birches gave way to a clearing, and in the center of the clearing stood the hedge. It was enormous, 12 feet tall at least, and woven from a plant that Poppy had never seen in any of her grandmother's botanical books. The leaves were a deep, dark green that bordered on black, and they were waxy, so that the rain pooled on their surfaces in perfect droplets before sliding off in heavy curves that hit the ground with a sound like someone flicking the side of a crystal glass. Ting, ting, ting. The hedge formed a perfect circle around something Poppy could not see, and there was no gap in it, no gate, no opening of any kind. It was, by all visible evidence, a solid wall of living vegetation. But Poppy knew better. She stepped up to the hedge and pressed both hands flat against it. The leaves were cool and smooth beneath her palms, and where she touched them, they trembled, not with fear, but with recognition, the way a dog's body might tremble when its person comes home after a long absence. A low sound rose from somewhere inside the hedge, a vibration more than a noise, felt in the bones rather than heard with the ears. It was the sound of something very old and very large shifting in its sleep. "I'm here," Poppy whispered. The rain intensified for a single, sharp moment. A sudden whoosh of increased downpour, as though the sky had drawn a deep breath and exhaled it all at once. And then the hedge began to open. It didn't part like curtains or swing like a door. Instead, the individual stems twisted and braided themselves around each other, creating an archway that grew upward and over, forming a tunnel of interwoven branches that led inward toward the center of the circle. The leaves brushed against each other as they moved, producing a soft, papery rustle, whish, 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 that sounded like pages being turned in a very large book. Poppy stepped through. The tunnel was longer than it should have been. Poppy had walked through it before 3 times now, to be exact. And each time it seemed to stretch just a little further, as though the hedge were extending itself to give her more time to prepare for what lay on the other side. The rain followed her inside, threading through the gaps in the woven branches in thin, diagonal streams that caught the dim light and turned it into something like liquid silver. These streams hit the ground of the tunnel in overlapping patterns, drip drop, drip drop drop, drip, creating a polyrhythmic percussion that echoed softly off the walls of living green. The air inside the tunnel smelled of wet earth and something else, something sweet and faintly metallic that Poppy associated with the castle itself. It was the smell of magic, if magic had a smell, which Poppy believed it did. Her grandmother had told her once that magic was what happened when the world forgot for a moment that it was supposed to follow rules. And in that forgetting, something beautiful and impossible slipped through. The smell was the evidence. The smell was the footprint. Poppy walked for what felt like 5 minutes, but might have been longer. Time moved strangely inside the hedge, stretching and compressing like a held breath. And then the tunnel ended, and she stepped out into the center of the circle. And there it was, the secret castle. It rose from the ground like something that had grown there rather than been built. Its walls a pale stone that turned the color of cream in the gray rainlight. Towers climbed upward at irregular intervals, some slender as needles, some broad and squat, each capped with a roof of dark slate that the rain struck with a sound like distant applause. S-H-H-H-H-H-H clap. S-H-H-H-H-H-H clap. A constant, rolling texture that formed the background of every moment spent in the castle's presence. Windows dotted the walls, hundreds of them, each one a different shape, round as an eye, tall as a tear, square as a thought. Some glowed with a faint interior light. Others were dark, reflecting the rain that ran down their glass in crooked, meandering paths. The castle's front door, the door with the moons and spinning stars, stood open. Just slightly. Just a crack wide enough for Poppy to see darkness beyond it, and to feel the warm breath of air that escaped from inside, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and old books and something baking, something with cinnamon and apples in it. The rain drummed against the stone doorstep in a rapid, eager pattern, tat-a-tat-a-tat-tat-tat, as though it, too, wanted to go inside, as though it had been pressing its face against the window of this place for 100 years, and was finally being allowed in. Poppy stepped over the threshold. The rain did not follow her inside. It stopped at the doorway, as though hitting an invisible wall, streaming down either side of the entrance in thick curtains that framed the open door like a pair of silver drapes. From inside, looking out, the world beyond appeared as though seen through a waterfall, shimmering, distorted, almost dreamlike in its soft focus and muted colors. Poppy turned away from the door and looked into the castle. The entrance hall was vast. The ceiling was so high that it disappeared into shadow, and the walls were lined with tapestries that depicted scenes Poppy did not fully understand. Ships sailing through skies instead of seas, trees whose roots reached up instead of down, animals sitting at tables and writing letters with quills held in their paws. The rain outside created a constant ambient sound that seeped through the stone walls, a muffled, oceanic shhhhhhhhh, as though the castle were submerged in water, as though the rain were not falling on it, but around it, enclosing it in a shell of moving water. The floor was black marble, polished to such a shine that Poppy could see her reflection in it. And when she looked down, she saw not just herself, but the ceiling above her, reflected and inverted, so that she appeared to be standing between two identical halls, one above and one below, with herself suspended in the space between them like a figure in a mirror looking into a mirror. A staircase curved upward from the center of the hall, its banister carved from a single piece of dark wood that twisted like a vine. Poppy had climbed this staircase before. On her first visit, it had led her to the library of unfinished stories, a room whose shelves held books that were still being written, their pages turning on their own as invisible hands penned new sentences in ink that glowed faintly blue. On her second visit, the staircase had led her to the kitchen of remembered meals, where food appeared on plates that tasted exactly like meals she had eaten in childhood. Her grandmother's apple crumble, her father's terrible pancakes, the chocolate cake from her 7th birthday that she had been so certain she'd forgotten, but which appeared on a porcelain dish with exactly 7 candles in it. Tonight, the staircase led somewhere else. Poppy could tell because the stairs themselves were different. On previous visits, they had been stone worn smooth by centuries of feet. Tonight, they were wood, the same dark, vine-twisted wood as the banister, and each step produced a different sound when she placed her foot on it. The first step creaked like a bird call. The second hummed like a plucked string. The third tinkled like a small bell. The fourth made a sound like someone inhaling sharply, as though surprised. The fifth sighed. The sixth laughed quietly. By the time Poppy reached the 7th step, she was smiling. By the 10th step, she realized the staircase was singing. It was not a song with words, or at least none that Poppy could identify. It was more like a melody constructed from the accumulated sounds of each step, layered on top of each other in a descending cascade that followed her as she climbed. A warm, rich, amber-colored music that filled the stairwell and resonated in her chest. The rain outside, still drumming its endless shhhhhhh against the walls, seemed to adjust its rhythm to complement the staircase's song. The two sounds weaving together into something unexpectedly beautiful. Something that made Poppy's eyes sting with tears she couldn't explain. She climbed 52 steps. She knew it was 52 because she counted them, and because each one announced its number silently in the shape of its sound. The 11th step had a sound like two sticks being tapped together once. The 23rd had a sound like 3 drops falling in quick succession. The 50th had a sound like a hand striking a drum 50 times in a single impossible beat. The mathematics of it were impossible. Poppy did not care. She had stopped expecting the possible on her 3rd visit to the secret castle. At the top of the staircase, she found a corridor. The corridor was narrow and long, lined on both sides with doors. Each door was different. Some were tall and narrow, others short and wide. Some were made of wood, others of metal, others of what appeared to be woven light. Some had handles shaped like animals, a fox, a raven, a fish with scales that glittered even in the dim light. Others had no visible handle at all, only a small symbol carved into their surface, a crescent moon, a lightning bolt, a single open eye. The rain sounds here were different. They came not from outside, but from behind the doors. Behind each one, a different rain, a gentle misting behind the door with the crescent moon, a violent downpour behind the door with the lightning bolt, a steady, rhythmic patter behind the door with the open eye, like a metronome keeping time for someone who was practicing something very difficult. Poppy walked slowly down the corridor, listening. The glass vial in her pocket grew warm against her thigh, and the luminous substance inside it moved with greater agitation, swirling and pulsing as though it could hear the rains behind the doors, and was trying to choose among them. At the very end of the corridor, past all the other doors, there was one that Poppy had not seen before. It was not particularly remarkable. It was made of plain wood, unpainted, with a simple brass handle shaped like a circle. But there was something carved into its surface that made Poppy stop walking and stand very still. It was a keyhole, not the image of a keyhole, an actual functional keyhole, a narrow vertical slot with a wider oval below it, dark and deep, and clearly intended for a key. And beside the keyhole, carved in letters so small that Poppy had to lean close to read them, were the words, "For the door that has no key." Poppy's hand went to her pocket. She pulled out the glass vial. The luminous substance inside was no longer swirling. It was pressing itself against the glass, straining toward the door, toward the keyhole, as though it recognized something on the other side, as though it were being called. "For the door that has no key," Poppy repeated softly. She looked at the vial. She looked at the keyhole. She looked at the vial again. Then she pulled the cork. The substance did not pour out. It leaped. It exited the vial with the speed and intentionality of a living thing. A stream of pale gold light that moved through the air with the fluid grace of a ribbon dancer, leaving a trail of warmth in its wake that Poppy could feel on her cheeks like the breath of a gentle fire. It reached the keyhole and poured itself in, not fitting through, because it was liquid enough to take whatever shape was needed, but filling the slot completely, perfectly, as though the keyhole had been designed for this exact substance and no other. For a moment, nothing happened. The rain behind all the doors in the corridor seemed to pause. The silence was enormous, a held breath that filled the entire castle, that filled perhaps the entire valley, that filled the sky itself, which for one impossible second stopped raining altogether. Then the door opened. Behind the door was a room, and in the room was a garden, and in the garden it was raining. Not the same rain that fell outside the castle. This rain was different. It fell upward. Poppy stepped through the doorway and stood at the edge of the most impossible thing she had ever seen. The room was large, perhaps as large as the entrance hall below, perhaps larger, its walls invisible behind curtains of climbing roses, whose blooms were the deep red of garnets, and whose thorns caught the light of the upward falling rain, and turned it into scattered prisms that threw tiny rainbows across every surface. The floor of the room was grass, real grass, soft and green and damp. And from this grass grew flowers of every variety Poppy had ever seen, and many she hadn't. Tulips whose petals were translucent as stained glass, daisies with centers that glowed like small suns, bluebells that actually rang ding, 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 each time a drop of upward rain passed through them. The rain itself was extraordinary. It emerged from the ground in thin, perfect streams, thousands of them, each one rising straight upward like a fountain in reverse. The drops caught the light as they ascended. The source of the light was unclear, but the room was bright, brighter than it should have been given that there were no windows and no visible lamps. And as they rose, they made a sound unlike any rain Poppy had heard before. It was a rising sound, a gentle, continuous woo-wash that was somehow also a shhhhhhh, and also a hum, a harmonic vibration that lived in a frequency between music and silence. It was the sound of rain played backward, which of course it was, and yet it didn't sound backward. It sounded like something that had always been going in this direction, and the rest of the world had been wrong. Poppy stepped onto the grass. It yielded beneath her feet with a soft, moist compression, squish, squish, and the upward rain passed around her body without touching her, parting like a curtain and closing again behind her, as though she were a stone in a stream, and the stream knew to flow around her rather than over her. In the center of the garden, there was a tree. The tree was not large. It was perhaps the height of 2 grown men, with a trunk no wider than Poppy's waist. But it was the most alive thing she had ever seen. Its bark was a deep, warm brown that seemed to pulse gently, like a heartbeat felt through skin. And its leaves, thousands of them, each one a different shade of green, trembled constantly, not from the upward drain, but from their own internal energy, as though the tree were vibrating at a frequency just below visibility. The roots of the tree were visible above the ground, twisting and curling across the grass in patterns that looked deliberate, intentional, almost like writing. Poppy walked closer. The upward rain thickened as she approached the tree, the rising streams converging toward it, being pulled toward it, as though the tree were the source of the rain, even though the rain clearly emerged from the ground. It was a paradox that Poppy did not try to resolve. In the secret castle, paradoxes were not problems to be solved. They were features to be experienced. She reached the tree and stood before it. Up close, she could see that the bark was not merely pulsing, it was breathing, expanding and contracting in a slow, deep rhythm that Poppy found herself matching without thinking, her own breath synchronizing with the trees until she could not tell which rhythm was hers and which was the trees. The leaves above her head made a sound like whispered conversation. FSSS, FSSS, FSSS. A constant, sibilant murmur that the upward rain threaded through like a needle through fabric. And beneath that sound, beneath even the deep harmonic hum of the ascending water, Poppy heard something else. A voice, not a voice exactly, more like the memory of a voice, or the idea of one, or the shape that a voice would leave in the air after it had finished speaking. It was faint, so faint that Poppy might have been imagining it, and yet she was not imagining it, because the words it spoke were too specific, too unexpected, to be products of her own mind. Sit, the voice idea memory said. Sit with me. I have been waiting. Poppy sat. She sat at the base of the tree, between 2 of its exposed roots that curved around her like the arms of a chair. The bark against her back was warm, warmer than it should have been, and the pulse she had observed from a distance was stronger here, more defined, a steady thump-thump that she felt not in her ears, but in her spine, in the base of her skull, in the spaces between her ribs. The upward rain continued its endless ascent around her. The woo-woo chasse cha-cha-cha-cha-cha, filling the room like the sound of breathing, fills a quiet room at night. The voice came again. You brought the light. It was not a question. Poppy understood that it was not a question. She nodded anyway. I didn't know what it was for, she said. Her voice sounded strange in this room, smaller than usual, as though the upward rain were pressing it down, flattening it, making it humble. It was for opening, the voice said. Everything needs opening. Even things that are already open need to be opened again. Each opening is different. Each time you open something, you find something different inside it. This is the nature of doors. This is the nature of minds. This is the nature of rain. The nature of rain, Poppy asked. Rain opens the sky, the voice said. It makes a door in the clouds and comes through. Each rain is a different opening. A storm is an angry opening. A drizzle is a shy opening. A sun shower is a mischievous opening. It opens the door and then closes it again while you are still looking. This rain, and here the voice seemed to expand, to fill the room, to become the room. This rain is a remembering opening. It remembers falling, and so it rises. It remembers the ground, and so it seeks the sky. It is going backward through its own story to find the beginning. Poppy looked up. The upward rain streamed past her face, each drop catching the light and carrying it upward, toward a ceiling she could not see. She watched a single drop travel from the ground to somewhere above her. And in the moment of watching, she understood something that she would later find very difficult to explain. But that felt, in the moment, as clear and obvious as her own name. She understood that stories worked the same way. They began at the end and went backward to find their beginning. The writer sat down with the ending already known, the feeling, the image, the last sentence, and then traveled backward through the narrative, upstream, against the current, looking for the source. The source was always somewhere unexpected. The source was always in a place you had already looked and dismissed because it seemed too small, too ordinary, too quiet to be the origin of something as large and complex as a story. The source of this story, her story, Poppy's story, the story of the girl who found the secret castle, was rain. It had always been rain. The tree breathed. The rain rose. Poppy sat in the space between them and felt something happening to her that she could only describe later as untying. There were knots inside her. She became aware of them now, as though the trees breathing and the rains rising were creating a kind of internal sonar that illuminated the hidden architecture of her body and mind. Knots of worry, tight and hard, in her stomach. Knots of sadness, older and denser, behind her sternum. Knots of fear, thin but strong as spider silk, wound through her throat and into her jaw. These knots had been there so long that she had forgotten they were knots. She had come to think of them as part of her structure, as necessary and permanent as bones. But they were not bones. They were knots. And knots, by their nature, can be untied. The trees breathing deepened. The upward rain intensified. The woo-woo sh-sh-h-h-h-h-h growing louder, richer, more complex, adding layers of sound that Poppy had not heard before, a high, sweet overtone like a choir of glass harmonicas, a low, resonant undertone like the hum of the earth itself, rotating on its axis. And as the sound grew more complex, the knots inside Poppy began, very slowly, to loosen. Not all at once, not dramatically, not with any accompanying sensation of release or relief. They simply loosened, one strand at a time, one coil unwinding here, one loop slackening there, so gradually that Poppy was not aware of it happening, until she noticed that she was breathing more deeply than she had in months, that her jaw was unclenched, that her hands, resting on the grass on either side of her, were open and relaxed instead of balled into fists. She had not known she was clenching her fists. She had not known she was holding so tightly. "What are you?" Poppy asked the tree, or the voice, or the room, or the rain. She was no longer sure which of them she was addressing, and she suspected that the distinction was irrelevant. "I am the memory of this place," the voice said. "I am what remembers that this castle was built not by hands, but by longing. Every stone was placed by someone who wanted something so deeply that the wanting became solid. Every tower grew from a desire that was too heavy to remain in the air, and so fell to earth and hardened into form. This castle is a museum of wanting. Every room is a different kind of wish. The library of unfinished stories is the wish to be heard. The kitchen of remembered meals is the wish to be loved. The corridor of doors is the wish for possibility, for the sense that there are always more doors than you think, more rooms than you've entered, more lives than you've lived. And this room," Poppy asked, "what wish is this?" A pause. The upward rain seemed to hesitate, its streams faltering for just a moment before resuming their ascent. "This room is the wish to be understood," the voice said. "Not by others, by yourself. It is the deepest wish and the hardest to grant, because understanding yourself means seeing yourself clearly, and seeing yourself clearly means seeing the knots, and seeing the knots means admitting that you tied them yourself." Poppy felt a pang of something sharp in her chest. Not pain exactly, but the precursor to pain, the warning tremor before an earthquake. "I tied them myself," she whispered. "You did," the voice said, and its tone was not accusatory or pitying, but simply factual, the way a tree might state that it grew its own rings, or the rain might state that it fell from its own clouds. "You tied them when you were afraid. You tied them when you were lonely. You tied them when the world asked you to be something you were not, and you chose to comply rather than explain. Each knot is a moment of choosing safety over truth. This is not a sin. This is not a failure. This is what children do when children are not yet strong enough to choose truth. But you are stronger now. You have been opening doors. You have been following rain. You are ready to untie." Poppy closed her eyes. Behind her eyelids, she saw the knots, not as abstract concepts, but as actual, visible structures, woven from threads of different colors. The worry knots were gray. The sadness knots were blue, a deep midnight blue that hurt to look at. The fear knots were a pale, almost invisible white, like spider silk, and they were the most extensive, threaded through everything else, binding the other knots together into a single massive tangle that sat in the center of her chest, like a bird's nest made of barbed wire. The upward rain's sound changed. It became more focused, more directed, as though the individual streams were no longer rising randomly, but were converging on a single point, the point inside Poppy where the knots were densest. The woo-woosh sh-h-h-h-h-h-h sharpened into something almost like a voice itself, a wordless vocalization that seemed to speak directly to the knots, to address them in their own language. And the knots began, very slowly, to respond. The gray ones loosened first. They were the newest, the most recently tied, and their threads were still flexible. Poppy watched them unwind with something like wonder, the strands separating from each other, uncoiling, straightening, and then simply dissolving, becoming part of the general warmth that filled her body. No longer distinct structures, but just energy returned to the system, like ice melting into the water it came from. The blue ones took longer. They were older, stiffer, their threads brittle with time. As they began to loosen, Poppy felt something that she recognized as grief. Not new grief, but old grief. Grief she had stored and compressed and packed away so tightly that she had forgotten it was there. It rose in her like a tide, warm and salt and unstoppable. And for a moment she felt as though she were crying, though her eyes were dry and no tears fell. She was crying internally, the grief moving through her like the upward rain moved through the room, rising, ascending, seeking the sky. She let it rise. She did not try to stop it. She did not try to direct it or control it or make it smaller or more manageable. She simply let it move, and in letting it move, she felt the blue knots loosening further, their threads fraying and separating, the midnight blue fading to a lighter blue, then to gray, then to white, then to nothing. The white knots were the hardest. They were the oldest. They had been there so long that they had become structural, integrated into the fabric of her being so thoroughly that removing them felt like removing bones. Poppy could feel the resistance in them, not active resistance, not conscious refusal, but the simple, inert resistance of something that has been in place for so long that it has forgotten it can move. These were the knots tied in earliest childhood, before memory, before language, in the pre-verbal darkness, where fear lived before it had a name. The upward rain surrounded them. The sound filled every corner of the room, or every corner of Poppy's interior self, which was perhaps the same thing. A vast, immersive shhhhhhhhhhh that was simultaneously the sound of rain and the sound of being held, the sound of being told without words that it was safe, that the untying would not destroy her, that she was not her knots, had never been her knots, was something larger and freer and more luminous than any tangle of fear could contain. One white thread loosened, then another, then another. Time passed. Poppy did not know how much. Inside the room with the upward rain and the breathing tree, time moved the way it moved in dreams, fluidly, non-sequentially, without the usual markers of before and after. She sat against the tree, and the rain rose, and the knots untied themselves, strand by strand, thread by thread. And Poppy watched it happen with a calm that she understood. In some new and unknotted part of herself was not the absence of feeling, but the presence of enough space to hold all the feelings at once without being overwhelmed by them. When the last knot finally loosened, a single white thread, impossibly thin, impossibly old, tied around something so deep inside her that she could not have named it even if she had tried. Poppy felt a change that was not dramatic, but was total. It was like the change that happens when a window is opened in a room that has been closed for a long time. The room is still the same room. The walls and floor and ceiling are unchanged. But the air is different. The light is different. The quality of everything in the room is different because of the simple fact that the air can move. She could move. Not physically. She had always been able to move physically. But internally, emotionally, psychologically, she could move in a way she had not been able to move since she was very small. She could turn her attention in any direction without encountering a wall. She could breathe in any rhythm without feeling constrained. She could think about the future without the white threads tightening. She could think about the past without the blue threads aching. She could sit in the present without the gray threads buzzing. The trees breathing slowed. The upward rain gentled, its streams thinning and softening until they were no longer fountains, but mists rising from the grass like early morning fog, their sound diminishing from a woo-whoosh to a whispers, to a barely audible h-h-h-h-h-h that was more vibration than noise. The voice spoke one last time. "This room will stay open," it said. "You will not need to find it again. It is inside you now, as all rooms become inside you once you have truly entered them. When the rain falls and you listen, you will hear this room. When you are afraid, you will feel this grass beneath your feet. When you are alone, you will feel this tree against your back. The secret castle is not a place you visit. It is a place you become." Poppy opened her eyes. The room was different now. Not in its appearance. The roses still climbed the walls. The flowers still glowed and rang. The grass was still soft and green. But in its quality, its texture, its felt sense, it was warmer. It was more present. It was as though the room had been a photograph before and was now a living thing, or as though it had been a story being told about a room and was now the room itself. Poppy stood up. Her legs were not stiff, though she had been sitting for what might have been hours. The grass released her feet without clinging, and the upper drain, now barely more than a fine, rising mist, parted around her one last time as she walked back toward the door. She paused at the threshold and looked back. The tree stood in the center of the garden, its leaves still trembling, its bark still breathing. Through the mist, it looked like a painting, like a dream, like something that might dissolve if she looked too long. But Poppy knew it would not dissolve. She knew it was real in the only way that mattered. It was real because she had been there, because she had felt it, because it had changed her. And things that change you are the realest things there are. She stepped through the door. The corridor was quiet. The rain behind all the other doors had stopped. Or perhaps they were merely listening, holding their own private storms in abeyance, waiting for Poppy to pass before resuming their separate downpours. Her footsteps on the stone floor were soft but audible, each one a small, definite tap in the silence. She reached the staircase. The steps did not sing this time. They were stone again, worn and plain and solid. But as Poppy descended, she noticed something she had not noticed on the way up. The walls of the stairwell were covered in carvings. Tiny, intricate carvings that she had been too focused on the singing steps to see before. They depicted scenes, hundreds of them, thousands, spiraling downward along the walls like a visual helix. Children playing in rain, animals sleeping in caves, ships arriving at harbors, seeds breaking through soil, stars being born, old people laughing, rivers finding the sea, and rain, always rain. Rain on every carving, on every scene, falling from tiny carved clouds in tiny carved streams, connecting all the images into a single, continuous narrative that said, without words, everything is connected, everything is moving, everything is being rained on, and everything is drinking, and everything is growing. Poppy reached the bottom of the stairs and stepped into the entrance hall. The front door was still open. Beyond it, the rain had not stopped. If anything, it had intensified during her time in the garden, and the silver curtain that framed the doorway was thicker, heavier, more substantial than before. The sound it made was magnificent, a deep, resonant shhhhhhhhh that filled the hall and reverberated off the marble floor and the tapestried walls, layering over itself into a chord, a rain chord, a sound so full and rounded that it seemed to have a physical presence, a weight, a mass, as though the sound itself were a kind of rain that you could cup in your hands and drink. Poppy walked to the doorway. She stood at the boundary between inside and outside, between dry and wet, between the castle's warmth and the world's cool, gray embrace. She could feel the rain on her face now. The castle's protection had withdrawn. Or perhaps she had outgrown it. Or perhaps it had simply decided that she no longer needed it. The drops were fine and cold, and they landed on her cheeks and forehead, and the backs of her hands, with a sound like tiny kisses. Mip, 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 gentle, affectionate, welcoming. She stepped out. The rain fell on her. All of it. Not just the fine mist at the edge of the curtain, but the full, deep, magnificent downpour that filled the valley and the sky and the world. It fell on her hair and her shoulders and her bare feet, and the sound it made was the sound of everything. Every rain that had ever fallen, every stream that had ever flowed, every ocean that had ever breathed, condensed into a single, overwhelming, beautiful SSSSSHHHHHHHHHH that was not noise and not music, but something in between. Something for which there was no word because the word had been rained away, dissolved, returned to the languageless place where all words come from before they are born. Poppy stood in the rain and let it fall. She walked back through the hedge tunnel, and the branches wove themselves closed behind her, and the papery wish-wish-wish of their movement sounded like a page being turned for the last time. She walked through the grove of silver birches, and the rain tapped their trunks. Talk, talk, ting, talk, in the same scattered melody that had accompanied her on the way in, though now it seemed less like a procession behind her and more like a celebration around her. The birches participating, contributing, adding their own voices to the general rejoicing of the rain. She walked down the path that led away from the secret castle, and the path was muddy, and the mud sucked at her feet with a soft, satisfied squelch that made her smile, because it was the sound of the earth drinking, and the earth had been so thirsty, and now it was drinking, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. The rain fell. It fell on the valley, and the hills, and the forests, and the fields, and the small town in the distance whose lights glowed amber through the gray curtain of water. It fell on the rivers and filled them. It fell on the lakes and deepened them. It fell on the graves of people who had loved and been forgotten. And it fell on the faces of bobbies who were too young to know that they were being rained on for the first time. And it fell on the roofs of houses where people sat inside and listened to it and felt, without knowing why, a kind of peace that they would not be able to explain the next morning, but that would stay with them, lodged somewhere in their chests like a warm stone, like a small, secret door that they had not known was there, but that was now quietly open. Poppy walked home in the rain. She was not afraid. She was not sad. She was not worried about tomorrow or regretful about yesterday. The knots were gone. The space they had occupied was now filled with something that she could only describe inadequately as whether a constant, shifting, internal climate that was sometimes sunny and sometimes stormy and sometimes gray and still and sometimes wild and electric. But that was always moving, always flowing, always raining and clearing and raining again. Because that is what weather does, and that is what people are when they stop being knots. She reached her grandmother's house. The lights were on. Through the window, she could see her grandmother sitting in her armchair, reading a book, a cup of something steaming on the table beside her. The rain ran down the window pane in crooked, meandering paths, and through these paths, her grandmother's face was fragmented and reassembled, pieces of her appearing and disappearing as the water flowed, so that she looked like a mosaic, like a stained glass window, like a story being told in fragments that added up to something whole. Poppy opened the gate. It squeaked a single, high-pitched E, and her grandmother looked up from her book and saw Poppy standing in the rain. And she did not look surprised or worried or disapproving. She simply smiled, the way you smile at someone who has come back from a long journey, the way you smile at someone who has brought something home with them that you can't see, but that you can feel, a warmth, a lightness, an openness, like a door that has been left ajar. "Come inside," her grandmother said. "You're soaked." Poppy walked up the path. The rain fell on the stones, plink, plink, plonk, plink. Each one a different note. Each one a small, perfect sentence in the rain's endless, ongoing, never-to-be-finished story. She reached the door and opened it and stepped inside, and the warmth of the house enveloped her like a blanket, and the smell of cinnamon and apples filled her nose, and somewhere in the house, a clock was ticking, tick, 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 marking time in its steady, patient way, unconcerned with the rain outside, trusting that the rain knew what it was doing, which of course it did. Poppy's grandmother wrapped her in a towel and sat her by the fire and gave her a cup of hot something that tasted like honey and ginger and safety. The fire crackled, crackle, snap, hiss, and the rain continued its steady drumming on the roof, tat-a-tat-a-tat-a-tat. And the two sounds, the fire and the rain, the inside and the outside, the warm and the cool, wove together into a single, seamless texture of sound that was, Poppy realized, the sound of being exactly where she was supposed to be. "Where did you go?" her grandmother asked. "To a castle," Poppy said. "Ah," her grandmother said, "the secret one. You know about it." "I found it once," her grandmother said. "When I was your age, I sat in a garden where the rain fell upward. I untied some knots. Then I came home and grew up and had a family and grew old. And somewhere along the way, I forgot that the castle was inside me and not just a place I visited. But I remembered tonight. When the rain started 3 days ago, I remembered. And I've been listening ever since." "What did you hear?" Poppy asked. Her grandmother looked at her for a long moment. The firelight danced in her eyes, and the rain shadow played across her face, and she looked in that moment, like two people at once. The old woman she was, and the young girl she had been, standing in an impossible garden, watching rain rise. "I heard you," she said. "I heard you opening doors." Poppy went to bed. Her room was warm and dark, and the rain on the window was a constant, gentle presence. S-H-H-H-H-H-S-H-H-H-H-S-H-H-H-H-H-H. Like a lullaby sung by someone who knew that the best lullabies were not songs, but sounds, not melodies, but textures, not stories, but the simple, abiding reassurance that the world was still there, still doing its world thing, still raining and clearing and raining and growing and sleeping and waking and being, endlessly being, without end. She lay under the covers and listened. She heard the rain on the roof, a deep, muffled drumming, like the heartbeat of the house itself, keeping time, keeping rhythm, keeping the world turning on its axis through sheer, persistent percussion. She heard the rain in the gutters, a higher, thinner sound, like a stream finding its way through a narrow channel, rushing and gurgling and splashing. Gurgle, gurgle, splash, gurgle, splash, splash. As it made its way down and out and into the ground, she heard the rain on the grass outside her window, the softest sound of all, a barely perceptible hush, hush, hush that was more felt than heard, a vibration in the air that said, "Sleep, sleep, I am here. I am falling, I am keeping watch. You do not need to keep watch. I will fall for you. I will fall all night. I will fall until morning. And in the morning I will stop, or I will not stop. And either way you will wake, and the world will be there, and you will be in it, unknotted and open and alive." Poppy closed her eyes. Inside her, in the space where the knots had been, in the room that the tree had shown her, in the garden where the rain fell upward, something breathed. Slowly, deeply, rhythmically. It was her own breathing, and it was also the tree's breathing, and it was also the breathing of the castle and the hedge and the silver birches and the valley and the sky and the rain itself, because everything breathed, and everything's breathing was connected, and the connection was not a metaphor but a fact, as solid and real as stone, as liquid and alive as water falling from a cloud and landing on a world that had been waiting for it. She breathed in, she breathed out. The rain fell, and in the valley, and in the town, and in the forests, and the fields, and the mountains, and the places too far away for any name to reach. The rain continued. It fell on the surface of lakes, and was absorbed into the earth, and was taken up by roots, and drawn into trunks, and carried into leaves, and released back into the air as invisible vapor that rose and gathered and condensed and fell again. An endless cycle, a story without an ending, a rain that had been falling since the beginning of the world and would fall until the end of it, and perhaps beyond, because rain did not know about endings. Rain only knew about falling, and falling was not a way of stopping, but a way of continuing. And continuing was not a way of holding on, but a way of letting go. And letting go was not a way of losing, but a way of finding. And finding was not a way of arriving, but a way of beginning. And beginning was not a way of starting, but a way of remembering that you had never really stopped, that you had always been moving, that the knots were just a pause, a held breath, a moment of stillness in a life that was, at its deepest level, as fluid and free and unstoppable as rain. The rain fell. It fell on everything. It fell on Poppy, who slept, who dreamed of castles and doors and gardens where water rose instead of fell, who breathed in time with a tree she would carry inside her for the rest of her life, who was, at this moment, at this exact point in the story, the most peaceful she had ever been, and who would carry this peace not as a knot, because peace is not a knot. Peace is the absence of knots. Peace is the space where the knot was before it was untied. But as a room, a garden, a tree, a rain, a sound that she could return to whenever she needed to, simply by closing her eyes and listening. The rain fell. The rain fell. The rain fell. And the world, wrapped in its silver curtain, drumming its endless, polyrhythmic, beautiful, impossible, necessary song against every surface of everything, settled into the deep, quiet, held breath hush of a night that was not ending, but deepening, not finishing, but becoming more itself, not going away, but going inward, into sleep, into dreams, into the place where all stories go when the telling is done and the listening begins. Good night. Sleep well. The rain will keep falling. She did not dream of the castle. This was surprising. Poppy had expected to dream of it, expected to find herself wandering its corridors again, or standing beneath the upward-drained tree, or pressing her palm against the door with the moons and spinning stars. These were the images that should have filled her sleeping mind, the logical narrative residues of what she had experienced. But the unconscious mind, Poppy was learning, had its own logic, and its logic tonight was not narrative but sensory. She dreamed of rain, not rain as she had ever experienced it while awake, but rain as it existed in its own essence, stripped of context, separated from the ground it fell on, and the clouds it fell from, and the air it fell through. Rain without a before or an after. Rain without a where or a when. Just the falling itself, the pure, abstract, platonic ideal of falling, which turned out to be not a visual experience at all, but an auditory one, a sound so deep and so vast that it occupied every frequency simultaneously, from the lowest sub-bass rumble to the highest ultrasonic shimmer, a single, infinite SHHHHHHH that contained within it every rain sound that had ever been made, and every rain sound that ever would be made. the rain of the first ocean forming on the young earth, and the rain that would fall on the last day of the last world, and every rain between, the rain that fell on Noah, the rain that fell on Cleopatra, the rain that fell on unnamed children in unnamed villages who looked up at the sky with the exact same wonder that Poppy had felt tonight. All of it compressed into a single, unbroken tone that she heard not with her ears, but with her entire body, every cell vibrating at the rain's frequency, every atom humming in sympathetic resonance with the water that was, after all, the original mother of all living things. In the dream, Poppy was the rain. She was not a girl watching rain, or standing in rain, or thinking about rain. She was the rain itself, each drop a thought, each stream a sentence, each puddle a paragraph in a story so long and so complex that no single mind could hold it all. Only the sky mind, only the cloud mind, only the vast, distributed water mind that thought in weather patterns and felt in barometric pressure and spoke in the language of falling. She fell on forests and felt the needles of pine trees beneath her, sharp and fragrant, tap, 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 each drop a tiny percussion instrument striking a tiny drum. She fell on oceans and felt the salt water receive her without a sound, or almost without a sound. A whisper so faint that only the fish could hear it. A piff, piff, piff that was the sound of fresh water meeting salt water. Two dialects of the same language greeting each other in the dark. She fell on deserts and felt the sand drink her desperately, each grain absorbing its drop with a sound like a kiss. Mip, mip, mip. The desert's dry lips parting for the first time in months, and the rain feeling, for a moment, like a visitor who had arrived at exactly the right time. She fell on the secret castle. In the dream, she fell on its towers and its walls and its slate roofs, and the sound she made was different here than it was anywhere else. On the towers, she produced a high, clear, bell-like tone, ting, 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 as though the stone were not stone, but crystal, not matter but music given form. On the walls, she produced a softer, rounder sound, thump, 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 like a heartbeat, like the heartbeat of the tree in the garden, like her own heartbeat, because they were all the same heartbeat, because everything that lived was beating in the same rhythm if you listened closely enough. And on the slate roofs, she produced the sound she had heard from outside, the applause sound, the shhhhhh clap, shhhhhh clap. But from inside the rain, from the perspective of the droplet rather than the listener, it sounded different. It sounded like applause received rather than applause given. It sounded like the castle was clapping for the rain, welcoming it, thanking it, saying, "Yes, yes, fall on me. I have been waiting. I am always waiting. I am a castle built from longing, and your falling is the answer to my longing. Your falling is the thing I was built to receive. Poppy fell and fell and fell, and the dream went on, and there was no anxiety in it, and no fear, and no urgency, because rain does not hurry, and rain does not worry, and rain does not wonder whether it is falling in the right direction, or at the right speed, or for the right reason. Rain simply falls. Rain trusts the falling. Rain is the falling, and for the duration of the dream, which might have been minutes, or might have been hours, or might have been the entire night, Poppy simply fell. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. She woke to the sound of rain, not the abstract, infinite rain of the dream, but the specific, local, this morning rain of her grandmother's valley. It was still falling. 4 days now, Poppy lay in her bed and listened to it hitting the window, tick, 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 tick. A rapid, staccato pattern that meant the drops were small and driven by wind, each one arriving at an angle and striking the glass with a tiny, determined talk before sliding downward in a thin, crooked line that merged with other lines and became a small river running down the pane. She lay still for a long time, listening. The rain on the roof was a deeper sound, thrum, thrum, thrum. A continuous, low-frequency rumble that she felt in her mattress more than heard with her ears. The rain in the gutter outside her window was a third sound, gurgle-sploosh, intermittent and chunky, like someone stirring a thick soup. And beneath all of these, beneath even the sound of her own breathing, and the ticking of the clock on the dresser, and the settling of the old house around her, there was the sound she had heard in the dream, the deep, oceanic shhhhhhhh, the bass note of the rain, the fundamental frequency upon which all the other rain sounds were built, like overtones on a violin string. It was still there, the dream rain, the essence rain. It had not disappeared when she woke. It was still sounding, still vibrating, still present in the world, and the waking rain was just its visible, audible surface, the part that ordinary ears could hear and ordinary eyes could see, while underneath, in the hidden dimensions of sound and meaning, the real rain continued its endless, infinite falling. Poppy got out of bed. The hallway was dark and cool. Rain sounds filtered through the house from every direction, from the roof above, from the windows on either side, from the ancient pipes in the walls that carried rainwater from the gutters to the ground, producing a hidden, internal plumbing rain that gurgled and clinked and hissed behind the plaster like a secret river flowing through the body of the house. Poppy walked down the hallway in bare feet, her steps silent on the worn carpet, and the house felt different to her this morning, not because anything had changed in it. The same walls, the same floors, the same faded wallpaper with its pattern of small blue flowers, but because she was different in it. The The untying had changed not just her internal landscape, but her perception of the external one. It was as though a filter had been removed from her eyes, or a volume knob turned up on her ears, or a window cleaned that she hadn't known was dirty. She noticed things she had never noticed before. She noticed that the wallpaper's blue flowers were not all the same blue. Some were the blue of a summer sky, some the blue of a deep lake, some the blue of twilight, and some a blue so dark it was almost black, the blue of the space between stars. She noticed that the wooden banister at the top of the stairs had a grain that flowed like water, like the grain of the vine-twisted wood in the secret castle staircase. And she wondered for the first time whether the castle's wood had come from a tree in this world, or whether it had grown from some other substance entirely. From longing, from wishing, from the accumulated desire of everyone who had ever wanted a door to open. She noticed the rain. She noticed it the way a musician notices music, not as background, but as foreground, not as atmosphere, but as the main event, the thing that was actually happening, while everything else was just context. She stood at the top of the stairs and listened to the rain playing the house like an instrument. The roof was a drum. The gutters were flutes. The windows were cymbals, each one producing a slightly different TSSSSSH depending on its size and the angle of the rain hitting it. The pipes were didgeridoos, deep, resonant, continuously droning, and the walls themselves, the floors, the very structure of the house, were the soundboard, the resonant chamber that amplified and enriched and gave warmth to all the other sounds, so that the total effect was not noise, but music, not chaos, but composition, not random percussion, but a piece so complex and so beautifully structured that no human composer could have created it, because only the sky could write a piece this large, and only the earth could perform it. Poppy stood at the top of the stairs and listened to the rain play her grandmother's house, and she understood that this was what the secret castle had given her. Not a magical ability to hear things other people couldn't hear, but the removal of the ability to not hear them. The knots had been earplugs. The knots had been blindfolds. The knots had been the things that said, "Don't notice. Don't pay attention. It's not important. It's just rain." And now the knots were gone, and the rain was just rain, and just rain was enough. Her grandmother was in the kitchen. She was standing at the stove, stirring something in a pot that bubbled and steamed and filled the room with the smell of oats and honey and something else. Brown sugar, perhaps, or vanilla, or simply the smell of warmth itself, which was a smell that Poppy could now identify with confidence, because the untying had sharpened not just her hearing, but her other senses as well. Colors were more vivid. Textures were more distinct. Smells had layers and depths that she had never perceived before. Like a painting that she had always seen as two-dimensional, suddenly revealing itself to be three-dimensional, each scent having a foreground and a background, and a middle distance where unexpected things lived. The kitchen window was open, just a crack, just enough to let in a thin stream of fresh, rain-washed air that entered the room like a shy visitor, hesitantly, apologetically, as though sorry for the cool dampness it carried. Through the crack, the rain sounds entered as well. Not the full, immersive downpour that Poppy had heard outside last night, but a selected, edited version of it. The window acting as a filter that allowed only certain frequencies to pass. The high, sharp ticking of small drops on the sill, the mid-range pattering on the herbs that grew in the window box, basil and rosemary and thyme, each leaf receiving its drops with a slightly different sound, so that the herb box was a small orchestra playing a piece in 3 parts. And beneath these, the ever-present SHHHHHH of the general rain, the bass note, the bedrock, the foundation upon which the smaller sounds built their fragile, beautiful structures. "Good morning," her grandmother said, without turning around. "Good morning," Poppy said. "Did you sleep well?" "I dreamed of rain," Poppy said. Her grandmother stopped stirring. She turned to look at Poppy, and her expression was one that Poppy had seen before, but could never quite name. It was a look that contained many things at once: recognition and tenderness, and something that might have been grief, or might have been joy, or might have been both simultaneously. Because sometimes, Poppy was learning, the deepest feelings were the ones that refused to be sorted into categories. "The rain dream," her grandmother said. "Yes, I had that too, when I was young. After my first visit to the castle." "What does it mean?" Poppy asked. Her grandmother turned back to the stove and resumed stirring. The pot bubbled glug, 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 and the spoon scraped the bottom with a soft, metallic SHHHK, SHHHK, SHHHK that blended with the rain sounds from the window into a domestic symphony, a kitchen concerto, a small music that was not designed to be beautiful, but was beautiful anyway, the way most true beauties were accidentally, incidentally, as a side effect of being fully what they were. "It means you've been claimed," her grandmother said, "by the rain, by the castle, by the part of the world that speaks in water instead of words. Once you've been claimed, you hear it forever. Not always loudly. Sometimes it's so quiet you'll think you've imagined it. But it's always there. A hum behind the silence. A shimmer beneath the stillness. The world is always making sound, Poppy. Most people have just learned not to listen. The castle unlearns you. They ate breakfast at the kitchen table. Oatmeal with honey and sliced bananas, and a pinch of cinnamon that Poppy's grandmother added with a flourish, as though cinnamon were a magic spell, and the oatmeal were a cauldron, and the breakfast were an act of sorcery, which, Poppy supposed, it might have been. In a world where castles grew from longing and rain, fell upward in secret gardens, The line between cooking and magic was perhaps thinner than most people suspected. The rain continued. Through the kitchen window, Poppy could see the garden, her grandmother's garden, which was ordinary and extraordinary in equal measure. Ordinary because it contained ordinary things: a lawn, a vegetable patch, a row of rose bushes along the back fence. Extraordinary because the rain was falling on it, and the rain, as Poppy was now incapable of not noticing, was never ordinary. It fell on the lawn, and each blade of grass received its drops with a sound like a tiny tent being erected, fip, 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 the grass bending under the impact and springing back over and over, a million tiny springs playing a million tiny notes. It fell on the vegetable patch, and the large leaves of the cabbage plants caught the drops and held them briefly before tipping and releasing them, drip, 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 a slow, patient, contemplative rhythm that was the vegetable garden's version of thinking. It fell on the rose bushes, and the drops caught on the petals and clung there, trembling, refracting the gray light into fragments of color, pink fragments, red fragments, white fragments, before finally releasing and falling to the ground with a sound like a sigh FSSS. That was, Poppy thought, the sound of beauty letting go. "Grandmother," Poppy said, "how many rooms are there in the castle?" Her grandmother looked up from her oatmeal. She chewed slowly, considering. Outside, a gust of wind sent a heavier wave of rain against the window. Woo-wash, tap-tap-tap-tap whoosh. A sudden, dramatic swell in the otherwise steady percussion, like a drum fill before a new section of a song. "I don't know," her grandmother said. "I only found 3, the library, the kitchen, and the garden, the one with the tree." She paused. "The one where the rain falls up. That's the one I found last night," Poppy said. "I know, I heard it. Heard it." "The rain changed," her grandmother said. 3 days it's been falling, and it's been the same rain the whole time, steady, gentle, thoughtful. The kind of rain that thinks before it falls, if you know what I mean. But last night, around the time you would have been in the garden, the rain changed. It got deeper, richer, like a voice that's been speaking quietly suddenly starts speaking with its full chest. I was sitting in my armchair, and I felt it in the floor, in the walls, in my own bones. And I knew someone was untying. Untying, Poppy repeated. "That's what the garden room is for," her grandmother said. "That's its purpose. The library is for stories, for the wish to be heard. The kitchen is for food, for the wish to be loved. The garden is for the wish to be understood. And understanding yourself, truly understanding yourself, means untying the knots you've spent your whole life tying. It's the hardest room to find and the hardest room to leave, because you can't leave it until the untying is done. And the untying takes as long as it takes, and you can't rush it, and you can't slow it down. You just have to sit there and let it happen." "How long did it take you?" Poppy asked. Her grandmother's eyes grew distant. The rain on the window filled the silence. S-H-H-H-H-H-S-H-H-H-H-S-H-H-H-H-H-H-H. A sound like a crowd whispering, like a forest breathing, like the world reminding them both that it was still there, still falling, still doing its patient, persistent, necessary work. All night, her grandmother said softly. It took me all night. After breakfast, Poppy went outside. The rain was heavier now than it had been during the night. A proper, sustained downpour. The kind that turns roads into rivers and gutters into waterfalls and makes the whole world sound like it's wrapped in a wet blanket. Poppy stood on her grandmother's front step and let it fall on her. It hit her shoulders with a sound like scattered applause. Pat, 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 pat. And ran down her hair in streams that she could feel, but not hear. The sound of water moving through hair being too quiet, too intimate, too close to the skin to register as an external noise. It pooled in the hollows of her collarbones and ran down her arms and dripped from her fingertips. Drip, drip, drip. Each drop hitting the stone step with a tiny, precise talk that was immediately swallowed by the general roar of the downpour. Like a single voice in a crowd, like a single raindrop in a rain. She walked into the garden. The grass was saturated, so wet that each step produced not just a soft compression, but an actual squelch, water being forced up from between the blades by the pressure of her foot. Squelch, squelch, squelch. A sound that was deeply satisfying in a way that Poppy could not have articulated, but that she felt in her belly. A primal, visceral satisfaction that came from interacting with water at its most abundant, from being immersed in the element that made up most of her body and most of the world and most of everything. She walked to the rose bushes. The roses were heavy with rain, their heads bowed under the weight of the water they held, each petal laden with drops that trembled on the edge of falling, but did not fall, held by surface tension, by that peculiar and invisible force that is the smallest and strongest of nature's hands. Poppy bent close and looked at a single drop on a single petal. It was perfect. A sphere, a tiny, flawless lens that contained within it an inverted image of the world, the gray sky, the dark earth, Poppy's own face, distorted and miniature, and strangely beautiful, like a portrait painted by a very small, very precise artist working in water instead of paint. The drop fell. It released its grip on the petal and dropped, a journey of perhaps 3 inches, lasting perhaps a quarter of a second, and hit the ground with a sound so small that Poppy would not have heard it if she had not been listening with the ears that the secret castle had given her. But she was listening with those ears, and she heard it. A single, clear, crystalline plink that rang out of the wet earth like a bell struck in a cathedral, a sound of such purity and precision that it seemed to contain within it the entire mathematics of water, the entire physics of falling, the entire poetry of a single drop completing its journey from sky to ground. Poppy straightened up and looked at the garden through rain-blurred eyes. Her own tears, or the rain itself, she could not tell, and the distinction she was beginning to understand did not matter. The garden was beautiful, not beautiful in the way that postcards are beautiful, composed, framed, idealized, but beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are simply allowed to be what they are: wet and heavy and dripping and alive, and utterly indifferent to whether anyone is watching them, which is, Poppy thought, the truest kind of beauty, the kind that exists without an audience, the kind that does not need to be seen to be real. She walked to the back of the garden, past the vegetable patch, past the compost heap that steamed gently in the rain, producing a warm, organic mist that smelled of decomposition and renewal, and the endless cycle of things dying and becoming the soil in which new things grew. At the very back of the garden, behind the old stone wall that marked the boundary of her grandmother's property, there was a gate. Poppy had never noticed the gate before. It was not hidden. It stood openly in the wall, its iron bars green with age, its latch rusted, its hinges stiff with disuse. But it was the kind of thing that you could look at 1,000 times without truly seeing, because it did not fit into the expected pattern of the garden, because it was a doorway where no doorway was supposed to be. And the human mind, even an unknotted human mind, had a tendency to edit out things that didn't belong. But Poppy's mind was less edited now. Her knots had been the editing tools, the things that cut and cropped and filtered reality into a shape that was manageable, that fit into the frames that the world provided. Without them, reality was larger, wilder, more detailed, more full of gates that led to places she had not yet been. She opened the gate. It screamed a single, high-pitched metallic shriek, ee, that cut through the rain sounds like a knife, and then dissolved, absorbed by the downpour, swallowed by the shhhhhhh that resumed its dominance the moment the gate stopped moving. Beyond the gate was a field. The field stretched downward from the garden, a long, gentle slope of grass and wildflowers that disappeared into a low-lying mist where the ground met the trees of the valley below. The rain fell on it without discrimination, on the grass, on the flowers, on the mud, on the small stones that dotted the slope like freckles. And the total sound it produced was not the shhhhhh of rain on a roof or the ticking of rain on a window, but something broader, more diffuse, more landscape-like. A continuous, shimmering wash of sound that had no edges and no center, that filled the air the way water fills a bowl, was not so much heard as inhabited. Poppy stepped into the field. The grass was longer here than in the garden, ankle deep, thick and lush, and heavy with water. And walking through it produced a sound unlike anything she had heard that morning. It was a swishing, swooshing sound, swish, swish, swoosh, swish, as the wet blades brushed against her legs, each blade producing its own tiny FSSSD as it was pushed aside, and then sprang back, the cumulative effect being a soft, continuous rustling that was somehow both intimate and expansive. Both the sound of her own movement and the sound of the field itself responding to her movement, participating in it, making music with it. She walked to the center of the slope and stopped. From here, she could see the entire valley, the trees below, the hills on either side, the gray sky above, and the rain falling through all of it, connecting everything to everything else with its invisible, inaudible, omnipresent threads of water. The visual effect was one of vertical stripes, the rain appearing as a series of parallel lines drawn from sky to earth, a patterning that gave the air a texture, a fabric-like quality, as though the world were wrapped in a gray veil made of falling water. The auditory effect was overwhelming. From the center of the field, with no walls to block or redirect the sound, Poppy heard the rain in its full, unfiltered magnitude. She heard it on the grass at her feet, hush, hush, hush. She heard it on the trees below, a deeper, more resonant thrum, 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 as the drops struck thousands of leaves simultaneously, each leaf a tiny drum in an enormous percussion section. She heard it on the hillside to her left, a sharp, slanted TSSSSDSSSSSSSS, where the rain hit the exposed rock face of an outcropping, the rock producing a harder, brighter sound than the softer, organic materials. She heard it on the hillside to her right, a muffled, absorbed thump, 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 where the rain fell on a patch of dense, clay-heavy soil that drank the water without producing any splash at all. The sound existing only as a low-frequency vibration that Poppy felt in her feet more than heard with her ears. And above it all, above the hush and the thrum and the TSSSS and the thump, she heard the sky rain, the rain that had not yet hit anything, the rain that was still falling, still in transit, still on its journey from cloud to ground. This rain made no sound itself. Falling water makes no sound until it strikes a surface. But its silence was not an absence. It was a presence, a vast, active, charged silence that hummed with potential. That was the sound of sound about to happen, of a million impacts being prepared, of a symphony waiting for its downbeat. Poppy stood in the field and listened to the rain not falling, and the rain falling, and the rain having fallen, all three existing simultaneously in the same acoustic space. The past and present and future of each drop overlapping and interweaving into a single, continuous fabric of sound that was, she realized, the sound of time itself, not time as measured by clocks, but time as experienced by the world, time as a flowing, continuous, irreversible process that was not separate from the rain, but was the rain, was made of the rain, was as wet and falling and alive as every drop that had ever fallen or would ever fall. She was not alone in the field. She realized this gradually, not through sight or sound, but through a feeling, a subtle shift in the quality of the air behind her, as though the space she occupied had acquired a second occupant, whose presence altered the atmospheric pressure by the smallest degree, like a pebble dropped into a still pond, creating ripples too faint to see, but too real to ignore. Poppy turned. An animal was standing in the grass about 20 feet behind her. It was a fox, a red fox, its fur darkened to near black by the rain, its ears flattened against its skull, its eyes fixed on Poppy with an expression that she could not read as either fear or curiosity or aggression, but that seemed to contain elements of all three, plus something else, something that she had never seen in an animal's eyes before, and that she recognized with a start as recognition. The fox recognized her, not as Poppy specifically, not as a named individual with a history and a personality and a grandmother who made oatmeal with cinnamon, but as something more fundamental, as a listener, as someone who could hear the rain, as someone who had been unknotted and was therefore, for the first time, truly present in the field, truly there, not just physically, but completely, with all of herself, all of her attention, all of her opened and unknotted and newly capacious being. The fox was testing her. Poppy understood this without understanding how she understood it. The fox was listening to see if she was truly listening. It was a test of presence, a cosmic pop quiz administered by a wet fox in a rainy field, and the passing grade was simply being here, really here, right now, in this moment, with the rain falling and the grass swishing and the mist curling and the world being as intensely, overwhelmingly, unignorably alive as it always was. And most people never noticed. Poppy stood still. She breathed. She listened. The fox held her gaze for a long moment, 10 seconds, 15, 30. And then it did something that made Poppy's breath catch in her throat. It sat down, not cautiously, not ready to bolt, but comfortably, casually, as though it had decided that Poppy was acceptable, that she had passed the test, that she was, in some fox internal rubric that no human would ever understand, someone worth sitting near. The rain fell on both of them. The fox's fur produced a different rain sound than Poppy's skin or hair. Where the rain hit Poppy, it produced a soft, flat pat, the sound of water striking a relatively smooth surface. Where it hit the fox, It produced a more textured sound, prickle, 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 as the drops penetrated the outer layer of fur and reached the denser undercoat beneath, each layer producing its own tiny sound, so that the fox was a small, two-part percussion instrument playing a duet with the sky. They sat together in the rain. Poppy did not try to approach the fox. She did not try to speak to it, or touch it, or make any sound at all. She simply sat, and the fox simply sat, and the rain simply fell, and the field simply was, and the moment, this ordinary, extraordinary moment, this unremarkable, miraculous moment, this moment that would never happen again in exactly this way, because no moment ever happens again in exactly the same way, simply existed, fully and completely and without apology, like a raindrop that has fallen and does not wish it had fallen differently. After a while, how long Poppy could not say, the fox stood up, shook itself, a sound like a small dog being vigorously towelled, F whip, F whip, F whip, and walked away into the mist. It did not look back. It did not need to. The goodbye had been complete in the sitting. Poppy walked back through the field, through the gate, through the garden, and into the house. Her grandmother was in the living room in her armchair, her book open on her lap, but her eyes looking out the window at the rain, which had, if anything, intensified further during Poppy's time in the field. It was now a proper storm. Not a violent storm, not a dangerous storm, but a full, committed, no-holds-barred storm that threw itself at the world with an enthusiasm that was almost joyful, as though the sky had been saving up this rain for a long time and was finally letting it go. The sound in the living room was extraordinary. The window was larger here than in the kitchen, and the rain struck it in sheets. WHO, sage tat 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 tat, WHO, sage tat 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 tat. A driving, rhythmic pattern that was almost musical, almost danceable. A sound that made Poppy want to move her body in some way, to sway or stamp or clap, to join the rain in its percussion rather than merely listening to it. The wind had risen too, and it pushed the rain against the window at an angle, so that the drops moved diagonally across the glass. SSSSSSWWWW whip, like fingers being dragged across a wet surface, like a bow being drawn across a string, adding a sustained, sliding note to the percussive texture of the impacts. There you are, her grandmother said. I saw you in the field. You saw me. I saw the fox first. Then I saw you. I watched you sit together. Her grandmother closed her book. That's a good sign. A good sign. The fox is the castle's messenger, her grandmother said. Not a messenger in the carrying letters sense. A messenger in the you have been seen sense. The fox appears to people who have been inside the castle and have been changed by it. It's a confirmation, a seal, a way of saying, yes, this happened. It was real. You are different now, and the difference is recognized. Recognized by a fox. Recognized by the world, her grandmother said. The fox is just the world's way of showing its work. The day passed in rain. Poppy did not go back to the castle. She did not feel the pull that had drawn her there on previous visits, the gravitational tug in her chest, the sense of urgency, the feeling that the castle was calling her, and she must answer. Instead, she felt something different. A settledness, a groundedness, a sense that the castle was not elsewhere, but here. Not a destination, but a condition. Not a place she needed to travel to, but a quality that the world could have at any moment if she was present enough to perceive it. She spent the morning in the living room with her grandmother, both of them reading, both of them listening to the rain, both of them existing in the same space without the need for conversation, because the rain was conversing for them, saying the things that words could not say, things about continuity and patience and the beauty of sustained effort, things about the fact that the rain had been falling for 4 days now and would fall for as many more as it needed to, and that this was not excessive or obsessive or unreasonable, but simply the rain doing what rain did, being what rain was, and that there was a lesson in this for anyone patient enough to learn it. In the afternoon, Poppy sat by the living room window and watched the rain in the garden. She watched it hit the bird bath, plink, plink, plonk, plink, sending small ripples outward in concentric circles that overlapped and interfered with each other, creating patterns of light and shadow on the water's surface that were never the same twice, because the rain never fell in exactly the same pattern twice, because the world never repeated itself exactly, because every moment was, at the deepest level, original, unprecedented, a first performance of a piece that had never been played before and would never be played again. She watched it hit the wooden fence at the back of the garden, thwack, thwack, thwack. A harder, more percussive sound than the rain made on softer surfaces. A sound that reminded her of the carved doors in the castle corridor, each one producing a different rain sound behind it, as though each door led to a room with its own weather, its own climate, its own private sky. She watched it hit the path that led from the garden gate to the back door. Spatter, spatter, spatter. The drops exploding on the hard stone surface into small crowns of water that rose and fell in fractions of a second. Too fast for the eye to follow, but not too fast for the ear to hear. Each tiny explosion producing a miniature piff that was, at the right volume and the right level of attention, a sound of extraordinary delicacy and precision, like a snowflake landing on a drum. And through it all, through the plinking and the thwacking and the spattering and the 1,000 other rain sounds that the garden produced, the deep S-H-H-H-H-H-H-H continued. The bass note, the foundation, the ground of all sound upon which the specific and the particular built their fragile, temporary, beautiful structures. In the evening, the rain changed again. It did not stop. It showed no sign of stopping. And Poppy was beginning to wonder if it would ever stop, if this was simply what the world was now, a world of continuous rain, a world that had decided to be wet and was committed to that decision. But it softened. The heavy downpour of the afternoon eased into something gentler, something more contemplative, something that fell not in sheets, but in individual drops, each one separate and distinct, each one taking its own time, falling at its own pace, as though the sky had shifted from a state of exuberance to a state of meditation. The sound changed accordingly. The driving WHOSH tat-tat-tat of the storm gave way to a slower, sparser pattern drip. Pause, drip drip, pause, drip. A sound that was less like percussion and more like a conversation, a dialogue between the sky and the earth conducted in the language of falling water, with the pauses being as important as the drops, the silences being as meaningful as the sounds. Poppy was in the kitchen again, helping her grandmother prepare dinner, peeling potatoes, which produced a soft, satisfying shhhk as the peeler removed the skin in long, curling strips. And the rain sounds through the open window had become so gentle, so subdued, that they were almost subliminal, existing at the very edge of hearing, like a thought you were not quite thinking, like a word you were not quite saying. "Grandmother," Poppy said, "you said you found 3 rooms in the castle. Do you think there are more?" Her grandmother was chopping onions, thunk, 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 each cut producing a small burst of onion-scented air that mixed with the rain-scented air from the window and created a smell that was both sharp and soft, both domestic and wild, both of the kitchen and of the world. "I think there are as many rooms as there are wishes," her grandmother said. "And I think there are as many wishes as there are people who have ever wanted something deeply enough to build a room for it, which means the castle is very large. Infinitely large, perhaps. Large enough that no one could explore all of it in a single lifetime. Maybe large enough that it couldn't be explored in 100 lifetimes. Then how do you find the right room? The one you need. You don't find it," her grandmother said. "It finds you. The castle knows what you need before you know you need it. The staircase leads where it leads. The door opens when it opens. You don't choose the room. The room chooses you. But the garden room, the room with the tree, that was the room I needed. It was the room you needed last night," her grandmother said carefully. "Tonight you might need a different room. Tomorrow, a different one. The castle is not a place you visit once and are done with. It is a place you return to again and again, and each time it shows you a different face, A different room, a different version of the wish you didn't know you were making. What if I go back and the door isn't there anymore? What if the castle is gone? Her grandmother set down the knife. She looked at Poppy with an expression that was simultaneously grave and warm, serious and tender. The expression of someone delivering important news that was both good and difficult. The castle will never be gone, she said, because the castle was never built. It was grown from longing, from wishing, from the accumulated desire of every person who ever wanted something impossible. That desire doesn't go away. It's part of the world now, as much a part of it as the rain or the grass or the stones in the ground. The castle will be there for as long as there are people who want things they can't have, who dream of doors that shouldn't exist, who listen to the rain and hear something more than water. It will be there for you, Poppy, whenever you need it. You just have to walk the path and let the hedge open and trust the staircase to lead you where you need to go. Night came. The rain continued, still soft, still gentle, still falling in that meditative, unhurried pattern that made the world feel like a place that had decided to slow down, to take its time, to let each drop be a complete and sufficient event, rather than just one in an infinite series. Poppy went to bed. She lay under the covers and listened to the rain on the roof, a sound like 1,000 tiny fingers drumming a lullaby on the ceiling above her head. Tip, 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 steady and even and warm, the sound of the world tucking her in. She listened to the rain in the gutter, gurgle sploosh, a chunky, irregular rhythm that was like a heartbeat that hadn't quite decided on its tempo yet, still experimenting, still finding its way. She listened to the rain on the window tick, 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 spaced and sparse, each drop a small, clear note in a melody that was being composed in real time, a melody that had never existed before and would never exist again, a melody that was being played just for her, right now, in this moment, by a sky that had been making music for 4 billion years and had not yet run out of ideas. She closed her eyes. Inside her, in the room that had opened when the last knot was untied, in the garden where the rain fell upward, in the space where the tree breathed, something stirred. Not urgently, not anxiously, just a stirring, a shifting, a gentle rearrangement of something that was settling into a new configuration, like a bird adjusting its position on a branch, like a cat curling into a new shape on a cushion, like a river finding a new channel through a landscape it has always known. The stirring felt like anticipation, not the nervous, tight, knotted kind of anticipation, the kind that comes from fear, from not knowing, from the need to control what cannot be controlled, but a different kind, an open kind, a trusting kind, the kind of anticipation that comes from knowing that something is coming, but not needing to know what it is, from being willing to be surprised, from having enough space inside yourself to hold whatever arrives. Poppy felt this anticipation and recognized it as the feeling of a door about to open, not a physical door, or not only a physical door, a door inside her, a door in the world, a door in the rain, a door that she would find when she was ready to find it, in the castle that was always there, in the garden that was always growing, in the tree that was always breathing, in the rain that was always falling. She breathed in, she breathed out. The rain fell. It fell on the roof and the windows and the garden and the field and the valley and the hills and the forests and the towns and the cities and the oceans and the deserts and the mountains and the places where no one was listening and the places where someone was. It fell on Poppy's grandmother, asleep in her armchair with her book on her lap and her glasses still on her nose. It fell on the fox in its den, curled around its kits, warm and dry beneath the earth, while the rain drummed on the ground above. It fell on the secret castle, on its towers and its walls and its slate roofs and its 100 windows and its corridors of doors and its staircase of singing steps and its garden of upward rain and its tree that breathed in time with the breathing of the world. It fell, and in the falling, it told its story, the same story it had been telling since the beginning of time, the story of water seeking the ground, of the sky giving to the earth, of the clouds emptying themselves so that the rivers could fill, and the plants could drink, and the animals could live, and the world could continue its slow, green, wet, miraculous business of being alive. It was not a complicated story. It was not a story with twists or surprises or dramatic reversals. It was the simplest story in the world, and it was the most important. And it went like this. Something falls, something receives it, something grows. Good night. The rain is still falling. It will fall for you. It will fall for everyone. It will fall until the world is done needing it. And then it will fall some more, because falling is what rain does, and being fallen upon is what the world does, and the meeting between them, the place where the sky touches the ground, the place where the falling meets the receiving, the place where the drop becomes the drink, and the drink becomes the growth, and the growth becomes the flower, and the flower becomes the seed, and the seed becomes the next thing. That place is here, is now, is this moment, is this bed, is this girl, is this sleep, is this dream that is about to begin and will be about rain, because it is always about rain, because everything is about rain, because rain is the language the world speaks when it has something important to say, and wants to say it gently, persistently, endlessly, without stopping, without giving up, without ever, ever ever letting you forget that you are part of it, that you are made of it, that it falls on you and in you and through you and as you, and that you are, in the deepest and truest and most rain-soaked part of yourself, exactly what rain is. Something that falls, something that is received, something that grows. Sleep